When I saw the small, barefoot prints on the snow, my breath caught, because I understood this wasn't an accident. Wolf tracks ran right beside them. I froze so hard my radio clicked in my glove, and I didn't even hear the static. The morning light was flat, no shadows, just the clean white and those twin paths threading into the timber like a sentence I was scared to read to the end. I told myself it had to be a trick of wind and powder. I told myself a coyote. I told myself anything that would let my chest keep moving. I thought that was the moment it would end, that I would call it in and stand aside for the others, but my boots stepped forward on their own. I was not out here as a tourist. I know this forest. I have counted elk sign after storms and followed blood trails that would turn a person to stone. I have seen what a hungry night can do. That is why the first thing I looked for was the break in the child's prints, where a body is taken off its feet. There wasn't one. The little steps wandered, slow, close together, then widened where the snow softened, then stumbled where the crust gave way. I could see knees pressed down, small palms braced in the ice, a place where the toes dug hard to climb a hummock. It told me a story I didn't want to hear. A tired child, alone, walking deeper. Right there beside that, the wolf. Long stride, sure. The pads crisp, the nails fine and straight. No churn, no rush, no scatter that says chase. It did not cross the child's path to cut ahead. It did not dart behind to drive the little steps into a drift. It kept a steady lane, a half-body's width away, like a road shoulder. Once the track line lifted where the wolf must have paused on a log, looked off into the birch, once I saw the light sweep where a tail brushed the powder, a soft arc, not the chaos of a lunge. He was walking, not as a hunter, but as a guardian. Those words stood up inside me, and I hated them for how much I needed them. The trail pulled us into the darker trees where the wind dies and the cold grows teeth. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was late to something I would never forgive myself for. I checked for blood. I checked for hair. I checked for that crushed, ugly place where a struggle thrashes the snow flat. All I found was a small sit mark, round and neat, and around it the wolf's path widening, looping, then settling again at the child's side. The loop made my skin crawl because it looked like a watchman's circle. It looked like a decision. I kept telling the radio I had sign and kept forgetting to lift the mic. I listened instead. The forest was small with silence. Every few breaths, the firs dropped powder like faint applause. The prints angled toward the creek bed, then changed their mind and edged along the rise. The wolf's tracks stepped ahead for a dozen paces, then fell back again, as if testing the way. I have tracked enough to know when I am reading into nothing. This wasn't that. Even my hands understood, and they started to shake. I thought the cruelest truth had already shown itself, that I was following the last pages of a story that only ends one way. I almost turned to call for the dog teams and told myself I would not look any farther, because looking makes it real. But the line of the wolf kept me moving. It was too calm. No hunger writes itself that clean. No chase leaves space like that between the pads and the little heel marks. I could not make sense of it, and the not knowing pulled me like a rope. A grouse flushed somewhere ahead, and I flinched so hard I bit my tongue. When the quiet closed again, I crouched and set my palm over a print the size of my own hand. The ice burned through my glove. I could feel the depth of the pad, the way the weight pressed forward, not down. A leading step. He had been guiding. I knew it in the way you know you are being watched, without seeing eyes. My breath fogged and clung to my scarf, and I tasted wool and iron and fear. I followed anyway, because there are moments when you are not allowed to be only a witness. The child's steps drifted to the left and then stopped, a small mess of toe marks and knee dents, and my chest locked because this was where it should turn bad. The wolf's path crossed close, so close the pad print kissed the edge of those tiny toes, and then the line carried on, steady as a metronome, back to that half-body's width and deeper into the trees. I told myself this was where it ended, that the next rise would show me what I dreaded. But the strange thing was that the wolf did not attack. It did not scatter the snow. It walked beside those little prints, as if it had chosen a child, and would not let the forest take her. My heart thumped so loud it felt like it lived in my throat. I kept to the edge of the prints, so I wouldn't blur what they were saying. The child's steps wandered, and then held a line, small heels and toes careful, as if counting breaths. The wolf's trail slid away into the trees, and for a moment I thought he was gone. Then, like a thought returning, his pads reappeared beside the tiny feet, same calm spacing, same steady drift. He wasn't shadowing to strike. He was moving like a metronome set to the child's fear. I saw the first tail sign where the track crossed a wind seam, a soft sweep on the crust, a clean curve. A hunter on the edge of a kill does not carry his tail like that. A hunter pins it low, tight, ready to drive. This arc was loose, easy, almost careless. He was not hiding. He was not trying to vanish between the trunks. He wanted to be seen by whatever watched, maybe even by the child. Farther on, the brush told another piece. Low spruce tips wore pale grooves, and a few dark hairs clung there, coarse and long. Something big had shouldered through ahead of the child, pushing branches aside and tasting the air. I raised my nose without meaning to, the way dogs do when they sort the world. The wolf had gone forward and come back, forward and back, the snow recording it all like a patient scribe. He was checking the road. He was testing the next bend for danger, and then settling again beside those small steps. The trail broke onto a pocket of open ground where the wind pooled the cold. There the child had sat. I could read it in the neat oval and the two hand marks on either side, fingers spread to keep balance. Around that small place, the wolf had written a circle, not tight, not panicked, a measured loop with even spacing. Pads placed, pause, pads placed again. The tail had drawn faint commas in the powder every few strides. He was not circling to close. He was circling to keep the world at bay. I stood with my hand open to the air, and it shook without my say-so. Then he was gone again. The child rose and walked on, steps a little wider now, and for several dozen paces there was only that lonely string across the white. The silence inside my head grew hard. I told myself the wolf had drifted downwind to line up the strike. I told myself this was how patience hunts. I decided the animal was only waiting for the good moment to pounce, and that the circle by the sight mark had been measuring, not guarding. I bent to call it in and tasted that old copper in my mouth. But when the wolf trail rejoined, it came from the front, not the back. He had gone ahead and returned to the child's side as if to say, this way, not that. His pads cut a clean path around a drifted stump, then fell back into that same half-body's width at her shoulder. He walked like a sentry. He walked like he had chosen a post and meant to hold it. I kept moving because I couldn't bear to stop, and because the story under my boots would not let me. The prints angled toward a tangle of deadfall, and on the splintered bark I found fresh gouges, not deep, just enough to show where a heavy chest had pressed and slid. A few strands of hair were snagged there too. He had pushed through, making a lane. The child used it. Her steps inside that lane were steadier, the toe marks cleaner. He was making choices for her, and she was taking them. That was the thought that put a cold hand at the base of my skull. Once more the wolf's marks faded out, and the timber swallowed him the way a crowd swallows a friend when you look away. I waited for the crash of brush, that means a rush. I waited for the greenwood scream magpies make when blood shows. I heard only the hush of my own breath and the dry whisper of snow slipping off fir boughs. The child paused again. A tiny heel caught the edge of a buried root, and there in the scuff the wolf's pads landed, just one stride, as if he had come back to check, to count, to make sure, and then he was alongside once more. He was not behaving like hunger. He was behaving like a rule. I told myself that rules break when the body wants. I told myself not to believe in stories, not here, not with a life so small it barely dented the crust. But the longer I watched that pattern, vanish, scout, return, circle, leave, reappear, the less it looked like waiting for a weakness, and the more it looked like holding a line against something I could not see. I pressed my glove over a pad print again and felt how the weight set forward, not down, as if the animal was always already moving to the next careful step. My heart would not slow. My mouth was dry, no matter how much cold air I swallowed. I kept walking, because the only way out of a story like this is through it. I had decided a moment before that the wolf was only biding time, stringing us both along until the place and the angle pleased him. That thought felt safe, familiar. It fit the world I knew, but the behavior kept getting stranger. The forest tightened until every tree felt like a rib around us. I kept breathing shallow because the cold hurt when I pulled it deep. The prints led me off the old trail and slanted toward a dark cut in the land. At first, it looked like ordinary drifted ground, smooth and harmless, and then the snow broke open to a drop. The child's steps changed there. The toes dug in, the heels slid, little palm marks pressed at the edge where the wind had shaved the crust thin. My legs went weak. I saw in my mind the way a small body can vanish into a crease and leave nothing but quiet behind. The wolf had not followed her to the lip. His track bent out wide, a clean arc with a pause where the pad stamped twice, as if he had stood and measured the span. He went around the ravine, not to the edge, but along a higher bench where the wind had packed the snow firm. There he walked forward alone and then came back, his own marks overlapping like careful stitching, and fell in again beside the child's path on the safe side. It looked like a hand on a shoulder. It looked like a choice made for both of them. I knelt to understand what my eyes were trying to refuse. On the narrow shelf above the drop, the wolf had pawed the powder away to show a stripe of ice. The claws had scored the glaze, a warning cut into winter. A line of faint tail sweeps ran behind it, not frantic, not wild, just steady strokes. He was telling the ground where they would go. He was telling anything with teeth to keep its distance. I moved along the bench and the land opened just enough to see the far wall. The wind had carved it smooth. On a stump at the bend I found bark, shaved by a heavy chest, and a few long hairs caught bright against the dark. The wolf had shouldered through and left a doorway in the thicket. The child used it. You could see how her steps straightened once she passed that place. You could see how the little toes no longer clawed for every inch. That was when the sound came. It floated from upridge, thin but sure, and it set every hair on my neck to stand. It should have been the kind of cry that ices your blood. It should have been the sound that empties you out. It wasn't. This howl wasn't threatening. It sounded like a call. It did not reach for fear. It reached for an answer. I whispered without meaning to, and the word was please. I waited for the answer to come from more than one throat. I waited for the chorus that means a pack is knitting the forest shut. The hills kept their silence. Once, a jay scolded and stopped. Once, a clump of snow sighed off a fir and left the branch trembling. The wolf's pads showed again at my feet, and in 3 strides they went from long and leading to short, and matched to the child's, as if he had slowed himself to meet her. I have seen chases. This was not one. This was keeping pace. We followed the bench as it stepped the ravine like a ladder. At each switch the wolf went ahead, tested the bend, and came back to that same half-body's width at her side. The child's marks told me she hesitated where the snow bridged a small run of black water. In the hesitation, there were 2 smaller prints, close together, where she had drawn herself tight. Beside them, the wolf had stood, the pads planted, the nails light in the crust, his weight tilted forward like a door held open. I kept talking into the radio and not sending, because I did not know what to say without breaking the spell I was afraid to admit I wanted. My throat hurt with the holding. My fear did not go anywhere. It grew its own roots and sat down inside me, but there was something else now, a pressure at the back of my eyes that felt like shame for everything I had decided about this animal before I met his story in the snow. Another howl rolled through the timber, a little nearer, and this time the end of it thinned like a question. I answered by moving faster. The ravine shallowed. The child's steps climbed a small rise and stopped in a cluster of scuffs and knee dents. For a breath, I could not make sense of it. Then I saw the small sit mark again, and around it, the wolf's loop, the same even ring as before, a patrol drawn with patience. He had circled once, paused in the wind, and left the kind of print you make when you put your weight down and look a long way off. The wind shifted and brought me a cold, faint scent that made no sense at all. Wet wool and wood smoke, human air, the trace of a home that should not be here. It snapped a picture into place in my mind. A camp, a road, a cabin, something close enough to reach if you knew where to step. I stood there arguing with myself about fairy tales and luck and the hard rules that never soften for anyone, not even for a child. The edges of the ravine blurred where drift met brush, and for a moment I lost the line. Panic cracked open in me so fast I could taste it. I thought the child was already gone, that the land had folded her in, and the wolf had finally taken what the forest would have taken anyway, and that all this sober, careful work beside her had been nothing but hunger wearing a mask I wanted to believe. Then the print sharpened again, as if the snow had decided to speak up. The wolf's track angled toward a stand of young aspens, bright stems banded with tooth marks where something had tested their bark. The child's steps followed, steady as a heartbeat. The bench broadened into a flat with a fringe of willow, and the air felt a shade warmer, like the breath of water under ice. I straightened without meaning to. The ground ahead looked easier. The pattern beside those small footprints held true. My fear did not vanish. It loosened its teeth. The story under my boots kept refusing the shape I tried to force on it. I wiped my eyes with the back of my glove and told the radio I was moving, truly moving now, and that I would speak when I had more than hope to report. I was not ready to say the word safe. I was not ready to say the word saved. I was only ready to keep going. The ravine fell behind us. The timber opened, and the trail pointed toward a low saddle where the light was better. I felt the pull of it like a hand between my shoulder blades. I could still hear the last thin thread of that howl inside my chest. Not a threat, a summons, a line thrown across the cold from one living thing to another. I followed, because I could no longer pretend I understood what I was seeing. We were walking inside an answer I had not known how to ask for, and I knew, without knowing how, that ahead of us waited something larger than fear. The saddle opened into a small bowl out of the wind, and the track slowed like a sigh. The child had stopped here. You could read it the way you read a face. There was the neat oval where a small body had settled. There were 2 hand marks pressed beside the hips, fingers splayed as if she had scooped the loose crust and let it fall through her gloves. Little curls of powder lay where she had pinched and sprinkled, play written right into the cold. It robbed me of breath because joy had stood in a place where fear should have filled every inch. The wolf's story lay down right next to hers. His pads came in from the windward side and then disappeared into a long, soft depression, the shape a big animal makes when it tucks its legs and drops its chest. No scramble, no rake of claws, no blur that says panic. He had folded himself to the earth and gone still. The tail mark curved around like a comma at the child's back, and the snow behind that curve was smoother than in front, as if his body had broken the wind for her. I walked the circle once and saw more than I wanted to understand. On the east edge of the sit mark, a single broad paw print lay like a seal, angled toward the drift. The snow there was pressed and feathered, not slammed, a careful weight, placed and lifted. If the wind had pushed hard, that paw and the body behind it would have stood between it and the small spine at the center of the oval. I saw it and couldn't hold back tears. I knelt and put my glove where the child's hand had been. The hollows were shallow, the fingers short. A few grains of ice had melted and refrozen inside the prints, the way they do when warm skin lingers. She had not only sat, she had stayed. The wolf's depression showed the same thing. Edges crusted, center packed, time enough for frost to take a set. They had faced the same direction. They had listened to the same trees. On the bark of a spruce just upwind, 4 light scratches climbed in a stagger, not the deep rips of a fight, just marks a standing animal makes when it braces to lift and look. A hair or two had snagged there, gray at the root, pale at the tip. 10 steps beyond, a wedge in the drift showed where a big chest had leaned and let the powder slide down its shoulders, building a low wall that held its shape in the still air. I wanted to call it instinct and leave it there. The truth looked too much like intention. I stood and tried to be hard again. I told myself animals don't give. I told myself this was the forest joke on my soft heart. I told myself a predator will rest wherever it pleases, and a child will play wherever she forgets to be afraid. I decided nature had only granted a pause, a mercy with teeth behind it, a brief reprieve before the rule returned. But the details kept refusing that ending. The wolf hadn't lain between the child and the open trees, the way a hunter would to hide a rush. He had parked his weight between her and the wind. He hadn't cut her off from the exit. He had left a clean lane open toward the light in the saddle. A few paces out, his pads walked forward alone, stopped, turned, and came back, like a scout checking the next step before the lieutenant moves. I don't talk like that. The snow made me. There was a smear at the edge of the sit mark where the child had dragged a mitten and drawn a crooked line. At the end of the line was a messy star, 5 short streaks where she must have poked with stiff fingers. The wolf's paw print sat just beyond it, toes forward, as if he had watched the mark appear and then chosen his place. A jay scolded once and went quiet. My radio clicked in my pocket, and I didn't lift it. The silence was full as a held breath. I took off a glove and let my skin find the cold in the wolf's bed. It burned. It told me how much heat he had spent to make that hollow, how much he had traded to calm the air at a child's back. My fear didn't melt. It moved over to make room for something that hurt worse. Respect is a sharp thing when you owe it to what you're supposed to dread. I walked the perimeter again and found the faint sweep of tail hairs closer to the child than before, as if he had curled tighter when the gusts came. No blood, no teeth marks, no dragged snow. The story was stubborn. It said he had guarded, not taken. It said both of them had waited, watching the same notch in the trees where the land fell easier. I wanted to end it there, to say they rested and rose and went on, and that the moment was only weather and luck wearing an animal's shape. It would have been cleaner to believe that. But there was some meaning in this. I could feel it like a wire under the skin, humming with a current I didn't know how to name. The trail out of the bowl pointed toward a stand of birch that flashed like bone in the gray light, and the wolf's prints went there first, measured and calm, as if the pause had been a plan, not an accident. I wiped my face, pulled my glove back on, and followed, because I had already seen more than I could explain, and something larger was waiting just ahead. The search widened until the woods felt busy with breath. Radios snapped and hissed behind me. Voices came and went, and the crunch of other boots stitched a second story over mine. We had dogs on the far ridge and 2 more sweepers along the draw, and still I kept to the edge of the single line that mattered. The prints ahead sharpened, their edges crisp as if the snow had been cut a moment before I arrived. The wind hadn't had time to sand them down. The child was close. The wolf was closer. What changed first was the brightness of the marks. Fresh snow clings to a new print like sugar, and it shone along the tiny toes and the heel dents. Beside them, the wolf's pads looked ink-dark, deep, the kind of depth that tells you the weight is still in the body that made it, still moving somewhere just out of sight. My heart beat so hard I felt it in my wrists. Fear kept trying to speak in me, and reverence kept putting a hand over its mouth. The trail began to drift right, drawn by something I could not hear until I listened with my feet. The ground softened, the air tasted different, and a dull hush gathered under the trees that only happens where water sleeps under ice. The wolf had moved ahead in longer strides, then returned, pads overlapping his own route as if he had tested the way. He led the child toward the creek, not down into the ravine's throat, but along a shallow bend where willow thickets broke the wind and the ice ran slow and thick. And at the bank his behavior changed. His tracks spread outward into a loose ring, pads placed at even intervals, a patrol drawn around an island of safety. Inside that ring, the child's steps paused and bunched, small heel marks side by side, toes turned in a little in that universal stance of children bracing against a new thing. There were no drag marks, no scramble, just the careful clutter of tiny boots at the water's edge. All around, the wolf had walked a boundary, not tight, not frantic, just enough to say mine without a sound. He was guarding as if the child were his. I found other sign that told me he was not only watching the creek. A crosswind had thrown in a fox, light-footed and curious, reds and neat little C's that angled toward the open place, and then broke off sharp where the wolf's ring cut across them. Farther up, a single cat track on a log, round and silent, had turned away in a clean pivot that left the bark unscarred. Between those turns, the wolf had stopped and stamped, front feet together, back feet together, a stout, square warning printed into the crust. I had seen him in fights only in stories the snow tells. This was a different kind of strength. It made something inside me kneel. The child's print showed a game at the edge of fear. She had scraped a mitten through the frost to draw a wavering line along the ice, and at the end she had poked a hole that darkened and did not break. The wolf's paw sat just past it, toes pointed down the shore, weight leaning toward the safer path. He had chosen for them again. My breath snagged because the hope of it hurt worse than dread. We moved with the line, me and the team that had finally found me. I signaled them quiet without looking back. The creek narrowed and the ice thickened. The wolf's pads jumped across a seam onto a low bar where the snow had drifted shallow, then returned to the bank and walked there instead, as if deciding that what he could stride in one move would be too much for small legs. Behind him, the child's steps stayed landfast, each one placed in a pocket he had already tested. Then the world tried to break me the old way. On a snag near the water, I found a bright thread of fabric, blue as a bruise. It fluttered so slightly, I thought at first it was my hands shaking again. It was the kind of sight that ends stories. I felt the ground tilt. I was sure I would find a body. I keyed the radio and could not make a voice. I swallowed the taste of iron and forced myself to read instead of guess. There was no tumble of snow where a small weight had gone down and not risen. There was no gouged ice. The fabric had torn on a broken twig at shoulder height for someone my size. For a child, it would have been above her reach, which meant the wind had worked it there from some other place, or the wolf had brushed it when he passed. A few steps on, The prints sharpened even more, the tails of crystal at their edges still lifted like lashes. They were minutes old. Relief hit so hard my knees went watery, and fear came right behind it, because minutes are nothing when cold is the other hunter. On the flat below a willow clump, the wolf had done another impossible thing I would not have believed without the marks. He had lain down again, not long, just long enough to smooth a pocket in the drift where the wind pooled. The child had stood inside that shelter, close enough that her steps overlapped the edge of his bed and blurred the line between their bodies. Around them, a second ring of pads overlapped the first, wider this time, as if he had widened the circle to warn off something that had come near. The hair rose along my arms. Every rule I trusted kept failing in the same direction. We pushed along the bank, and the creak sound changed under the ice to a hollow, bell-like note that meant it was thinning toward a shallow ford. The wolf's tracks went ahead and back and ahead again, painting arrows I could feel in my legs. The child's prints followed like trust. Somewhere beyond the bend, a branch popped with the cold, and I flinched so hard the world blinked. When it came back, my eyes were wet, and I didn't bother to hide it. I loved that animal, and I was scared to death of him at the same time, and I did not know how to carry both. The timber opened to a small gravel fan pressed flat under snow, and the wolf's pads ran straight across it toward a stand of alder that looked like a gate. I lifted the radio at last and found my voice because I thought the next step would be the one that ended it, the one where the story dropped me through the ice, but instead I heard a child's cry. The sound came again, thin and real, and then the trees parted the way a curtain parts when a hand finally remembers it can move. She stood on the gravel fan where the snow lay thin as flour. Her face was raw with cold, her mouth open on a cry that came and went like a bird. Her hands were up at her chest, small and stiff, and she was looking at the wolf, not at me. He was between us, tall and still, his breath a slow thread, his body turned sideways to make himself wide. The creek under the ice sang one low note and would not stop. I said her name, and it hurt to say it, like the sound had to scrape through all the fear I had swallowed. She flinched and looked at me, and in that blink the wolf did not move. His ears tracked me, and then settled. His tail hung easy, not tucked tight, not high. Every muscle in me wanted to rush, and every lesson I had ever learned held me where I was. I set my boots very carefully so I would not crush the news written all around us. He turned his head and found me. There was no mistake in it. He looked at me like I was his. I felt it as a weight between my ribs, heavy and impossible. I had no words and too many. I lifted my empty hands and let them hang where he could see them. The child made a small sound that was half sob and half breath, and took one tiny step toward me. The wolf stayed. I spoke to him without thinking. I told him what I was going to do. I told him I did not want to take anything from him except the job he had kept longer than I can understand. I told him I would make it gentle. My voice cracked and the last word broke into the air like a twig. He watched my mouth shape it and then looked past me at the line of trees as if measuring how much time he had left to give me. The team broke through the alder behind me, faces white, hands raised, all of us speaking with our shoulders to each other, with the angle of our bodies, with the simple, stubborn choice not to shout. The wolf's eyes came back to mine. The creek note hummed under our feet. For a long moment, the three of us stood inside a shape I have no name for, a child, a man, a wild thing holding a place between them like a door. I eased forward. The wolf drew a single breath that lifted the fur along his ribs and settled it again. He did not show tooth. He did not lower his head to cut me off. He shifted his weight so the child was in the clear. She looked at him, then at me, and then she took 2 steps and fell against my legs so hard my knees almost buckled. I picked her up, and she was light as a coat when you first lift it, heavy as the world when you hold it close. Her hair smelled like cold and smoke. She buried her face in my collar, and I felt the heat of her mouth through the cloth. My heart stuttered, then ran. I turned so the team could see she was breathing, so they could move, and in that turn, I looked back. The wolf had not moved. He had his head high and his eyes steady, and I could feel the distance he held like a line on my skin. The urge to thank him out loud was so strong it made my hands shake. I did it anyway. I told him I saw him. The words came out low and rough, more breath than sound, but he blinked once, slow, in a way that felt like understanding, even if it could not be. Then he left, not with panic, not with the ragged run of a creature chased from a kill. He stepped sideways, found his path, and walked up the line of alder into the darker timber, not looking back, not speeding, as if the choice had been made and the work was done. The place he had been filled with air, and I felt the cold flood in, as if the world had forgotten to hold its breath. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I would carry the child out and tell the story and spend the rest of my life trying to make my voice steady on the part where his eyes met mine. I thought the forest had closed the book right there on the gravel and ice, but the animal came back. I lifted her higher on my hip and felt the small weight of her settle against me, all bones and heat and the wet sound of breath trying to become steady again. The team fanned out without words, making space with their bodies, watching the trees and the open creek and the air itself as if danger could grow there. I tucked the edge of my coat around her hands. The world narrowed to the smell of smoke in her hair and the rough rasp of my own voice saying it was over, saying we were going home. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that everything I had read in the snow was only a story I needed. The child turned her head, her eyes fixed on the rise above the alder gate, and mine followed because children always look at the truth first. He stood there, higher than us by the height of a truck hood, a single gray shape against the pale sky. He did not crouch. He did not lower his head. He stood as if the ridge belonged to him, and the moment did too. The wind pulled his fur one way and then the other, and could not decide which direction mattered. I said nothing. The team said nothing. Even the creek swallowed its one bell note for a breath. The wolf drew in the air and let it out as a long, clean sound that climbed and thinned and hung like a thread you could hold if your hands were steady. It was not a rallying cry. It was not a knife. It sounded like goodbye. It sounded like a door closing with care so it will not wake a sleeping house. The little body in my arms went still. Then she smiled. The kind of small, exhausted smile that happens when a person recognizes a face in a crowd, and she pushed her mitten out past my collar toward him. Her fingers could not open all the way, but the gesture was clear. The clumsy, holy reach of a child offering thanks for something she does not have words for. I felt my throat close. In his eyes there was a wisdom I did not understand. He shifted his weight and made a motion that was not a bow and not a nod, and somehow both. It was small. It was enough. The line between the three of us drew tight for a second, and I knew with the kind of knowing that lives under the bones that we were parting not as enemies, not as strangers, but as beings who had carried the same thing across a piece of cold earth and were setting it down together. If your heart is holding its breath right now, you know what I mean. Follow this story. Nature tells the truth here. The wind found its voice again. Somewhere behind us, a radio cracked and hushed. I said his name out loud, the wrong thing and the right thing, a human word for a wild shape, and thanked him anyway. He flicked an ear, not at the sound, but at the intent inside it, and the world felt both larger and kinder than it had any right to be. He turned as if to go, and I thought that was the last of it. Relief surged so hard my knees softened, and with it came that old instinct that tried to fix this day in the safe frame of luck and timing. I wanted to fold it away and call it chance. I wanted the forest to be simple again, the way it is in stories you tell to children when you want them to sleep. But he did not leave in a straight line. He walked along the crest, slow and level, and stopped above each of us in turn, laying his eyes on every one of my people, like he was counting, like he needed to be sure of something. He paused longest over the dog handler, because the shepherd at her heel had lifted its head and offered a quiet whine, not fear, not challenge, just recognition. The gray's gaze softened in a way that made my skin prickle. He knew the job. He knew we had taken it back from him. The child shifted and I felt her mouth move against my jacket. She said something I could not catch, a small shape of a word swallowed by cloth and wind, and her mitten touched my cheek before it reached again toward the ridge, slower now, like a goodbye waved as a train begins to move. The wolf blinked once, a long, deliberate close and open, the way a person does when the conversation is finished and nothing more should be said to ruin it. I wanted, with everything I had, to stop reading meaning into lines laid down by pads and chance. I told myself that a howl is a howl, and a stare is a stare, and a nod is just a weight shift on a narrow spine. I told myself I was only a man in love with a story. I told myself to carry the child and be done with it. But then something happened that changed everything. We turned for home as a group, but it felt like the forest had narrowed to the space between my heartbeat and the child's breath on my collar. I kept looking back at the ridge where he'd stood. It was empty now, only the wind combing the alder and the long scratch of sky. The team spoke in short pieces on the radio, and every syllable sounded like it didn't belong to this place. I walked the first yards without trusting my legs, afraid that if I blinked, I would open my eyes on a different world where none of this had happened. We followed our own prints out, but the snow had already begun to soften their edges. The child stirred against me and turned her face toward the hills. That was when the howl came again, far off, thin with distance, a line thrown from one ridge to another and not meant to call anything closer. It drifted over us and thinned in the trees like smoke. It sounded like farewell. The little body in my arms warmed and went quiet, as if a hand had smoothed her hair. I did not answer. I did not dare. At the first bend above the creek, we found his pads again, where the wind had left a clean page. He had walked parallel to us at the edge of the timber, not close, not crowding, just there, matching our pace for a while like a shadow that knows a road. Then his trail cut out in front, crossed our line, and returned to the hill. It looked like a sweep to scan the ground ahead and then a step back to let us pass. I kept telling myself not to read into it, and the snow kept writing anyway. A quarter mile on, long enough for fear to ease and then tighten again, we saw where another life had tried to thread our path. A coyote had angled down from the brush, light-footed and curious, its track quick and tidy. At the lip of the open, the coyote's prints faltered. The wolf's pads came in heavy and sure, stamped twice, front feet together, back feet together, and the smaller trail pivoted and left without a sound. On a deadfall just beyond, cat pads, round, silent, did the same, a clean turn, no scratch, no quarrel, just a decision. He had been watching our backs even after he gave the girl to my arms. My chest hurt with how wrong I had been and how grateful I was to be wrong. We reached the long run of birch that shows the way to the road. In their white shade, his sign thinned and then was gone, as if the forest were swallowing him back. I kept seeing his eyes anyway. Every time the wind dropped, I half expected to hear that quiet note again. Instead, there was only the soft rush of our boots and the dog's low whine like a prayer it didn't know the words to. I wanted to set the child down and see if her small steps would find his line, but I held her tighter because the thought of letting go felt like blasphemy. I had spent a lifetime saying I knew the rules. I said them to rookies, to hunters, to myself on bad nights. Out here, a body is meat or it is moving. Out here, hunger writes the law. But today, The law had bent around a child and did not break. Nature showed me that animals remember kindness. I don't know whose kindness this was or where it began. Maybe just the simple, old kindness of a wild thing guarding a smaller one, because the wind cut sharp and the creek sang cold, and something in him would not allow the worst to happen on his watch. My throat burned and also eased, both at once, and I let that hurt live where it wanted to. When the road finally showed, I thought relief would wash everything clean. I thought the world would slide back into its ordinary rails and carry me with it. I told myself I would sleep and wake, and this would fade to a tale you only tell when people ask for the strangest thing you've seen. I thought I would forget this day, but on the last rise before the trucks, the howl reached us one more time, threadbare with distance, almost lost in the wind. The child lifted her head and smiled into my coat without opening her eyes. I turned and saw nothing but light through birch and a long slope of untouched white. The sound didn't ask for anything. It only marked a moment and let it go. We stood in it for a breath that felt like a year, and then we walked on because there was nothing else to do. The road took us, the team took over, the radio found the loud world again. I gave the girl into warm hands and watched steam rise off her jacket in the February sun. I kept seeing a gray shape on a ridge that no longer held him. I kept hearing a note that was not a threat. I kept feeling a gaze that had put me down inside it and then set me free. I told myself time would file it all smooth. It didn't. The memory has chased me my whole life, light-footed as a shadow in fresh snow, always a step to my right, always just at the edge of the trees, waiting for me to admit that I have no name for what we were given and no measure big enough to hold it, and that something greater was still waiting ahead. I still do not believe what I saw, and yet my body carries it like a scar that does not hurt until you press it. Nights when the house is quiet, I can feel the cold air on my face again, and the smell of alder and creek comes back as if I had stepped outside. I close my eyes, and there he is, the gray shape on the rise, the stillness that was not threat, but purpose. I see his eyes first. They did not shine like fire. They held steady, dark, and level, and they found me as if I were a thing that mattered. He looked at me like I was his. I had never known it was possible to be seen that way by a wild animal whose life owes us nothing. I remember the girl's hand. It was a small, clumsy mitten, stiff with cold, and she pushed it out past my collar as far as she could. She did not know the words for thanks. She only reached. That reach was brave in a way adults forget. It was simple and exact. It told the truth we are always walking around. I felt her warmth on my chest. I heard her breath soften. I heard the creek under the ice say its one low note, and I thought the world had been made new in that second, and I was being asked to notice. And the prints. I cannot stop seeing the prints. 2 lanes cut into white like a sentence the wind could not erase. On one side, small steps that wandered and corrected and sometimes fell to knees and hands and rose again. On the other side, pads placed with a patience that did not belong to hunger, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, often right beside, a half-body's width away, as if a shoulder and a shoulder had learned the same rhythm. I had walked the length of that sentence with my head down, reading with my feet, and every time I think of turning away from what it meant, those 2 lines come back and ask me to finish. I keep trying to fit it into the rules that kept me alive long enough to tell this. I keep trying to say I misread the snow. I keep trying to say I wanted a miracle so much that I was willing to paint it on a clean page. But then I remember the way the wolf lay in the drift with his body turned to break the wind at the girl's back. I remember the ring he walked at the water's edge, wide enough to claim the ground without trapping her inside. I remember the scratches on Spruce where a heavy chest had lifted to scan the bend, and the double stamps where he had blocked the smaller hunters who came late to the story. I remember the moment he looked at me and moved aside so I could take her, as if a hand had passed a weight to another hand, and both had agreed. I did not deserve it. None of us did. We had brought our noise and our fear and our belief that we knew what the forest always does, and yet he chose to stand between a child and the worst that can happen when cold and dark are the only laws. He did it without witness, without promise of praise, without any reason except that the day asked him and he answered. I will never know what brought him to her. I do not need to know. The not knowing is part of the gift. When I try to tell it clean, I think of the sounds. The first thin cry that pulled us through alder, the quiet breath of the wolf in the still air, the way the creek kept to its one note like a string that would not break, the long, even howl on the ridge that was not a blade and not a drum, only a line stretched between living things so they could say goodbye without losing each other. I stood in that sound and felt something inside me change its weight and slide to a new place. People ask if I was afraid. I was afraid the whole time. Fear sat in my ribs like a fist and did not unclench even when I lifted the girl. But there was another thing braided through it, soft and strong, and it did not come from me. It came from the steady way he walked beside her. It came from the patience written into the snow. It came from the choice he made to leave when I could hold what he had held. I have told this story many times, and I do not tell it to make a hero out of a wolf. I tell it because it makes me small in the right way. It puts me where I belong, as one life among lives, as one voice among voices, as one pair of eyes that was given more than it asked for and cannot pay it back. Nature showed me that animals remember kindness. Maybe not the kind we measure with trades and debts, but the older kind that keeps a watch, that shelters a small body from a hard wind, that walks a boundary and says this one is under my care until someone else can take over. I did not believe that before. Now I cannot stop believing it. Sometimes I wake to the winter light at the window, and for a breath I think I hear that farewell again, far and thin, a thread of sound that never asks and never explains. Then the room settles, and I am back in the present, and still I feel the look that met mine on the gravel bar. It was not a trick. It was not a dream. I have tried to throw doubt over it, and it does not hold. I have tried to forget, and the memory will not be trained. Such a thing does not happen. But I saw it with my own eyes. The wolf did not kill. He guarded, and it changed me forever. If your heart is full of reverence right now, and if you also believe that animals are wiser than us, right, we are not alone in this world.
The autumn fog hung thick over Hope Valley Cemetery, a blanket of mist that seemed to weigh down the world itself. The first rays of sunlight cut through the mist like a dagger. Max was no ordinary dog. His fur, a patchwork of golden brown and scarred remnants of past struggles, bore witness to the life he had lived. He wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian, Hope Valley's unofficial protector. But today, something was wrong. His usual warmth had turned to frantic aggression, and his barks became more desperate with each passing minute. As the sun rose higher, more people gathered at the cemetery, drawn by the dog's unusual behavior. "He's never like this," Sarah Thompson said, her voice trembling as she stood beside the cemetery caretaker, William Anderson. Something's terribly wrong. Sarah had grown up with Max, though their relationship was complicated. She loved him. Elizabeth had rushed back into the inferno, saving Max, the golden Labrador puppy, moments before the roof collapsed. Her last words had echoed in Sarah's mind. Sometimes, love means sacrifice. The town knew Max well. He had become a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. But today, He was not showing the kindness he was known for. As Sarah watched the dog, his eyes wild with urgency, she felt a familiar ache in her chest. The grave marker beside him was crude, nothing more than a wooden cross bearing the name Nathan. Who was Nathan? And why was Max so adamant about protecting this spot? Max barked again, his voice carrying over the cemetery like a haunting wail, his paws digging frantically at the loose earth. He was desperate, as if trying to uncover a terrible secret buried beneath the soil. "William, there's something wrong here." "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. The caretaker, William, was no stranger to death or grief. He had worked at Hope Valley Cemetery for over 40 years. But the dog's behavior was something he had never seen before. His old eyes scanned the scene carefully. "There's no Nathan scheduled for a burial," William said, his voice grave. He pulled out his well-worn logbook, flipping through the pages filled with meticulous records. "This grave wasn't here yesterday. This isn't right." By the time the police arrived, the situation had escalated. Sheriff David Barnes and his deputies approached with caution. Max, normally so calm, growled deeply at their presence, as if warning them to stay away. The town was used to the idea of Max being a protector, but no one had ever seen him this intense, this frantic. "This is an active investigation now," Sheriff Barnes declared. His voice held authority that had been earned over decades of service. "We need to get a court order for an exhumation." Max's eyes never left the crude wooden cross. His barking had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was more unsettling than any noise could ever be. There was something beneath the earth, something that Max knew, but no one else could comprehend. The sheriff had made the decision. A judge granted the order, and the digging began. The cemetery grounds were disturbed, and the townspeople watched in silence as the first shovel broke the surface. It was then that the impossible happened. A faint, muffled sound emerged from the earth, a sound that could only be described as the unmistakable sound of human breathing. As the realization struck, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The crowd's whispers faded into a quiet horror. The grave wasn't just a disturbed patch of earth. Something was buried there. Max, who had been silent, let out a single, mournful howl, a cry that resonated deep within Sarah's chest. She had no idea who Nathan was or would have been buried here, but one thing was certain. This was not an ordinary grave. This was a mystery, and it was only just beginning to unfold. The digging continued as the crowd grew, its collective breath held in suspense. The sound of shovels scraping the earth was the only noise that filled the air, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to echo across the graveyard. Max remained at his post, unwavering, his eyes locked on the hole, now deep enough to reveal a wooden box. The dog's form was taut, his tail stiff as a board, watching as the earth was removed inch by inch. He was not just a pet, not just an animal. In that moment, Max was a symbol of something greater, something far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. Sarah stood beside William, unable to tear her gaze away from the scene. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm to match the chaos unfolding before her. The sun was high now, but the temperature had dropped and a chill had settled into the bones of the townsfolk gathered around the site. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would emerge next. Sheriff Barnes, his face grim, motioned for the forensics team to proceed with caution. "We don't know what we're dealing with here," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "Be careful. This may be something far darker than a simple burial." The air was thick with tension as they uncovered the last few inches of the box. Max's growl deepened, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. The dog's eyes flashed from the box to the people surrounding it, as though he knew what was coming, though no one else could understand. Finally, the box was fully exposed, and Sheriff Barnes gave the order. "Get that lid off." With a careful, measured movement, one of the officers pried open the wooden lid. The moment the box creaked open, a wave of horror rippled through the crowd. Inside, pale and disoriented, lay a young man. His eyes were wild with fear, his body bound but still very much alive. His breathing was labored, his face streaked with dirt, but there was no mistaking it. This young man had been buried alive. Sarah gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth, her stomach turning. This wasn't just some accident, some misguided burial. Whoever had done this had meant for the boy to die. The cruelty of it was unfathomable. But what was worse was the piece of paper pinned to his chest. It was written in careful, precise handwriting, words that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. This is just the beginning. Some debts can never be paid. Max let out another growl, his body now trembling with an energy that seemed almost supernatural. His head turned towards Sarah, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that no human could comprehend. The message was clear. The dog knew more than anyone in that cemetery. He wasn't just guarding the grave. He was protecting something far larger than anyone could imagine. The young man in the grave, now being tended to by paramedics, groaned, his head lolling as he regained consciousness. His eyes locked with Max's, a flicker of recognition passing through them before he lost consciousness again. The dog stood tall, unblinking, never once looking away from the boy as the paramedics moved him to safety. "He's alive," Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had just witnessed. The pieces weren't fitting, not yet, but something told her that this moment was just the beginning of a far more complex story. As the paramedics worked, Sheriff Barnes turned to Sarah and William, his brow furrowed in thought. "This boy, he's got connections. There's something more here. We need to get him to the hospital, get some answers. We'll question him when he's stable." William, who had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a grave concern in his words. This grave, it wasn't part of any burial records. The last burial here was 3 days ago. There's no Nathan listed for a funeral, no permits filed. This isn't just a random act. Max barked sharply, breaking the tension in the air, as if agreeing with William's statement. The dog's loyalty, his connection to the situation, was undeniable. He was not just a companion. He was part of the story, as much as the young man now being rushed to the hospital. As the police began securing the area, Sarah's phone rang. It was the one person she never expected to hear from today. "Sarah, it's William. You need to come to the hospital. There's something you need to see, something that ties all of this together." The ride to Hope Valley General Hospital was a blur for Sarah. She was overwhelmed by the urgency of the situation, her mind spinning with questions. Who was Nathan? Why had he been buried alive? And why was Max so protective of his grave? When she arrived, she was ushered into the emergency room where the young man, Nathan, had been stabilized. The sterile scent of the hospital mixed with the feeling of unease that clung to Sarah like a second skin. Max, who had followed her in, lay at her feet, as ever loyal, as ever vigilant. Robert Mitchell, one of the wealthiest men in the area, approached Sarah as she stood near Nathan's room. He looked tired, worn, as though the weight of the past few hours had aged him by years. "Sarah," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. "Nathan, he's my son, and he's been taken. Someone wanted him to suffer." He stopped, his face crumbling under the weight of his words. "I paid the ransom, everything they asked for. They said they'd release him, but then they sent me photos of the grave, of him buried alive." Sarah's eyes widened. The grave. The boy in the grave. It was all connected. Just then, a nurse emerged from Nathan's room. "He's stable, but he's asking about a dog. He's asking about Max." The room felt heavy with unspoken questions as Robert and Sarah stood side by side. Max, who had remained by Sarah's side, stood up suddenly, walking toward Nathan's door. There was something about the dog's movements that felt different now. He wasn't just a pet. He was a living testament to loyalty, courage, and a promise that had been made long before Sarah had fully understood its weight. The mystery was unfolding, but in this moment, with Max standing tall before the door, Sarah knew that the dog was the key to unlocking everything. Whatever had happened, Whatever darkness had driven Nathan to the grave, Max was the bridge, and he was about to lead them all to the truth. The silence in the hospital corridor was almost suffocating as Sarah stood beside the door to Nathan's room. Max, who had been following her every step, was now sitting quietly just outside, his posture alert, his eyes fixed on the door. Sarah's heart was racing. She had never felt this kind of urgency before. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they were still scattered, too unclear to form a coherent picture. Yet in her gut, she knew this story wasn't just about a boy in a grave or a dog's loyalty. This was about something much bigger. Robert Mitchell, the wealthy businessman who had been thrust into the storm of mystery surrounding his son's abduction, looked drained. His usually polished appearance was gone, replaced by a man whose carefully constructed world had been shattered in a matter of hours. His eyes were fixed on the door to Nathan's room, the anxiety written all over his face. He had lost control of everything. "Sarah," Robert's voice cracked as he turned to face her. "Do you believe in fate? Because I don't know how else to explain this." Sarah didn't answer right away. She just stared at the closed door, her thoughts spinning. If it weren't for Max, would Nathan have been found alive? If the dog hadn't stood sentinel by that grave, would anyone have known that a life was being slowly extinguished beneath the earth? The question hung heavy in the air, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Max had always known this moment was coming. She placed a hand on Max's head, feeling the tension in his muscles. He was more than just a dog. He was the key to unlocking everything, past and present. "I don't know what's happening, Robert, but we need to find out what happened to Nathan and what happened to my mother." Max, as if on cue, let out a soft whine and stood, his golden fur catching the dim light of the hospital. Sarah followed the dog's lead as he made his way to Nathan's room, gently pushing the door open. Inside, Nathan lay in a bed, his face pale, his body wrapped in bandages. But his eyes, they were alive, full of fear and recognition. Max padded into the room with Sarah right behind him, his tail giving a soft wag, though his eyes remained sharp. He approached the bed with an intensity that left no doubt in Sarah's mind. Max knew Nathan. He had known him for years. Nathan's face flickered with a faint smile when his eyes met Max's. It was as though a piece of him had been found again. "Mox!" Nathan's voice was hoarse, but the recognition was clear. "You're the dog from the sanctuary. The one she saved." Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. The sanctuary. The words pierced through her, slicing into the layers of grief and confusion she'd been carrying for years. Nathan, despite his frail state, seemed to know more than anyone had given him credit for. He knew about the fire. He knew about her mother's sacrifice. "Tell me what happened, Nathan," Sarah urged, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "What do you remember? What do you know about my mother and the fire?" Nathan's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and the room fell silent. The hum of the machines, the distant sounds of nurses and doctors, faded away as Nathan began to speak in fragments. I was there. I saw it. I saw what happened. The fire wasn't an accident." His voice was barely a whisper. "Your mother, she was protecting me." Sarah took a step closer to the bed, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Protecting you? From what? From who?" Nathan looked at her with haunted eyes. "From Cooper." Max, who had been lying by the bed, suddenly stood up and let out a low growl, his attention snapping to the door. Sarah froze, her heart racing. Was it him? Had Cooper, the man who had tried to ruin everything Elizabeth Thompson had built, finally come for the boy? Before Sarah could react, the door to Nathan's room burst open. Sheriff Barnes entered, flanked by his deputies. His face was grim, his eyes darting to Max, then to Nathan, then to Sarah. "There's been a complication. We need to move Nathan immediately. Cooper's men, they're still out there. We're not safe here." Max's growl intensified, his muscles rippling under his fur. It was as though he knew exactly what was coming. The sound of approaching footsteps that did not belong to any law enforcement officer, was enough to send a jolt of fear through Sarah's spine. "We have to go now," Sheriff Barnes said, his voice sharp. "We've got a safe house lined up for Nathan. Max, too. He's the only one we can trust to protect him. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers rushed to secure the room. Sarah, still reeling from Nathan's revelation, didn't fully process the danger until she saw the look on Robert Mitchell's face. The wealthy businessman was no longer just worried about his son's safety. His face was drawn with something darker, something far more sinister. "Sarah," Robert said, stepping closer to her, his voice low, "this isn't just about Nathan anymore. This is about everything your mother uncovered. The sanctuary, it was never just about saving animals." Sarah's mind raced. "What do you mean? What was the sanctuary really about?" Robert paused, swallowing hard. The sanctuary was more than just a place for abused animals. It was a front, a way to expose the darkness in the corporate world. Your mother discovered something massive. That's why she died. Cooper wasn't just trying to destroy the sanctuary. He was trying to destroy everything your mother had uncovered about corporate corruption. He wanted to bury the truth. Nathan's voice was weak but firm, and I was part of it. I saw things. I knew about the dog fights. I knew about the money laundering. Cooper didn't just destroy the sanctuary. He destroyed my life. Max's growl deepened as the door to Nathan's room slammed shut, sealing them in. The dog was now standing, his body tense and ready for action. Sarah could feel the urgency in his movements, the weight of the situation pressing in on her. "Max," she whispered, kneeling beside him, "you've been protecting us all along, haven't you?" Max didn't respond, but his eyes, filled with a wisdom that transcended words, told her everything she needed to know. He had always known what was coming, and now it was up to Sarah to protect what remained of her mother's legacy, and to uncover the full truth of what had been buried, both in the ground and in the dark corners of the world around them. The evening sky over Hope Valley had darkened, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as Sarah and Max, accompanied by Robert Mitchell, Nathan, and Sheriff Barnes, prepared for a move that would change everything. Cooper's men were still lurking, and there was no telling when they might strike. Max's eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room as if he could sense the threat lingering just outside. Nathan's condition had stabilized somewhat, but the emotional toll of what he had experienced was evident in the haunted look in his eyes. As he was moved to the safe house, his eyes never left Max's form, the loyal dog who had protected him and his mother's legacy. Max, for his part, was unshaken, though his every muscle was poised, ready for anything. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's mind kept circling back to the revelations Nathan had shared. It was as if the pieces of her mother's life, her sacrifice, her work, her love for animals, were being rearranged into a horrifying new shape. The fire at the sanctuary, the bizarre grave with Nathan buried alive, the unsettling message that had been left behind, all of it pointed to something far darker than Sarah had ever imagined. "Your mother was onto something," Robert whispered to Sarah as they walked through the sterile halls, a quiet urgency in his voice. "She wasn't just saving animals, Sarah. She was saving people. But she was also exposing a network of corruption that reached farther than any of us could have known." Sarah glanced at him, her heart in turmoil. "But why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she warn me? All these years, I've been thinking she died saving Max. And now it's clear it was something far more dangerous." Robert stopped and placed a hand on her shoulder, his face filled with regret. "She couldn't, Sarah. She had to protect you. She knew how far this would go. Cooper was only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more at play here: money laundering, illegal dog, fighting rings, even human trafficking." Nathan stirred in the bed behind them, weak but alert. Cooper wanted to bury the truth. He knew that if your mother exposed everything, it would be the end of him and his operations. Sarah felt a cold chill seep into her bones. The thought of her mother, her strong, compassionate mother, dying not just to protect Max, but to protect everyone from sinister underworld, was almost too much to bear. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was the truth. The sanctuary wasn't just about rescue. It was a hidden battleground between light and darkness, and her mother had been a warrior in that fight. Max, sensing her emotional upheaval, patted over to Sarah, nudging her hand with his head. His touch was grounding, a reminder of the unwavering loyalty and strength he had displayed all these years. The bond between Sarah and Max, once clouded by grief and resentment, was now clear. Max wasn't just a dog. He was her mother's legacy, and he was her guide now. Max knew everything, didn't he? Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. He knew the dangers, the secrets. He protected us from them, even when we didn't understand. Robert nodded, his eyes softening as he watched Max. Max was more than just a survivor of the fire. He was part of the plan. Your mother saw something in him, something special. She knew he could be the key to bringing this all to light. Sarah, her mind racing, finally spoke the words she had been avoiding. What happens now? How do we stop them? Robert's face hardened, and his tone shifted to one of grim resolve. We go to the source. Cooper won't stop. He'll do anything to keep the truth from coming out. But we have one advantage now. The truth is on our side. We've got the evidence, we've got Max, and we have to use it. The safe house was tucked away in a quiet corner of Hope Valley, an old cabin on the outskirts of town, secluded and secure. As they arrived, Sarah helped Nathan into the house, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced around, searching for any signs of danger. Max followed close behind, his eyes sharp, his every movement reflecting his role as a protector. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The small group gathered around a table in the living room. The walls, lined with old photos and faded memories, felt strangely out of place, as if the peaceful setting didn't belong in the midst of the storm they were facing. Sheriff Barnes took a seat, his eyes scanning the group. We need to move quickly. We've got the evidence we need, thanks to Max's behavior at the cemetery and Nathan's testimony. But the clock's ticking. Cooper will come for us soon, and we need to be ready. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what the next step was, but she knew it involved exposing Cooper's web of deceit. It wasn't just about the sanctuary anymore. It was about everything her mother had fought for, everything that had been buried under lies and corruption. Nathan, still recovering, spoke weakly but with conviction. We can't let them get away with this. I saw what they did. I saw how they were planning to use the sanctuary's resources to further their operations. We have to stop them before they hurt anyone else. Max, who had been quietly observing, stood up, his eyes focused. He was ready as Sarah was to face the dark forces that had been lurking in the shadows of Hope Valley for years. The door creaked open behind them, and Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a police officer or one of the safe house's caretakers. It was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. Sheriff Barnes stood up abruptly. Stay behind me, he ordered Sarah, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. We don't know who's coming through that door. Max's growl rumbled low, a sound that sent a shiver through Sarah's spine. She turned to see the dog's posture change. He was ready for action. The door opened fully, revealing a tall figure dressed in a dark coat, face hidden in the shadow of his hood. As he stepped into the light, Sarah's heart sank. It was Cooper. Cooper's eyes gleamed with a mixture of madness and control, his lips curling into a sneer as he took in the room. You didn't think it would be this easy, did you? His voice was low and menacing. You come too far, Sarah. Too far to turn back. Max, his ears flat against his head, took a step forward, a growl rising in his throat. The tension in the room escalated. Cooper wasn't just here for Nathan. He was here for everything that Sarah's mother had fought to expose. But Max wasn't afraid. He had faced worse. He had survived a fire, a network of cruelty, and a life of violence. And now, he was ready to face the man who had caused so much destruction. Sarah's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Max, stay close, she whispered, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. We're not backing down. The room felt like it was closing in on Sarah. Cooper's presence was suffocating, his arrogance filling the small cabin, pushing against the walls. Max stood firmly between Sarah and the man who had caused so much pain, his body coiled with tension, ready to spring into action at any moment. The Golden Labrador's growl was the only sound in the room, echoing off the walls, resonating deep within Sarah's chest. Cooper, towering and smug, stepped further into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room with cruel precision. His hand rested casually on his belt, where Sarah knew he kept a weapon. But Max's posture, solid and unwavering, told her that the dog was the one in control now. "You've really done it, haven't you?" Cooper said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop me? You think you can expose the truth and come out of this unscathed?" Sarah stood taller, her voice steady despite the storm of fear inside her. "You don't get to decide who wins, Cooper. You don't get to bury the truth anymore. You try to take everything from us, but we're not backing down." Robert Mitchell, who had been standing silently, finally spoke, his voice cold and determined. "You've lost, Cooper. The truth is out. We've got the evidence. You're done." Cooper's lips curled into a bitter laugh. "You think that matters now?" His eyes flicked to Nathan, who was still lying weakly in the bed. "It's too late. You've all played your parts, but it ends here. It ends now." Max's growl deepened, and the hairs along his back bristled. The dog had been through so much, yet here he stood, still loyal, still ready to protect Sarah and her family, even when facing the man who had torn their lives apart. Max's eyes met Sarah's, and for a moment, the noise in the world faded away. It was just them. She understood now what her mother had known all along, that Max wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of everything good in the world: courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. He had lived for this moment. He had been trained for this fight, not to harm, but to protect. He had chosen to defend the helpless, to stand guard when no one else would. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by a sharp motion. Cooper's hand shot toward his coat, and for a split second, Sarah thought he was reaching for a weapon. Much faster. In an instant, the dog lunged, his body a blur of golden fur. He was on Cooper in an instant, knocking the man off balance. The weapon fell to the floor with a loud thud as Max pinned Cooper down, his powerful body pressing against the man's chest. Cooper gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "No, you're supposed to be dead," he stammered, disbelief lacing his voice. Max didn't flinch, his eyes locked with Cooper's, unwavering, unblinking. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment that would determine everything. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding in her ears, her hand reaching for the phone in her pocket. "This is over." "Cooper," Sarah said, her voice steady, full of determination. "You're not getting away with this. Not this time." She dialed 911, her fingers trembling but firm as she spoke into the phone. "This is Sarah Thompson. We need backup. We got Cooper here. The man behind the sanctuary fire, the abductions. Get here now." As she hung up, she turned to Robert, who had taken a step forward, ready to take control of the situation. "Get Nathan out of here. They're coming." Without hesitation, Robert nodded, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Stay safe, Sarah. We'll get through this. Together." As Robert and Nathan made their way to the back of the cabin, the door burst open. Sheriff Barnes and his team stormed in, weapons drawn and eyes sharp. They took in the scene immediately, Max standing triumphantly over Cooper, who was now pinned to the floor. The sheriff's face was a mixture of relief and resolve as he stepped forward. "Cooper," Sheriff Barnes said, his voice low and commanding, "you're under arrest. For murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and everything else we've uncovered. You got a lot to answer for." Cooper's expression shifted, the arrogance draining from his face, replaced by a look of panic. You don't understand. You can't." "Shut up," Barnes ordered. "We know exactly what you've done, and it's over." Max released his grip on Cooper, but he didn't back down. The dog stayed close to Sarah, as if guarding her for whatever threat might come next. As the deputies moved in to cuff Cooper, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle over Sarah. Her mother's death, the fire, the mysteries of the sanctuary, it was all unraveling. The truth had been buried for so long, but now it was out in the open. Later, as the sun began to set over Hope Valley, Sarah stood in the front yard of the safe house. Looking out at the peaceful scene, Max sat beside her, his golden fur shining in the fading light. Despite everything they had been through, despite the fear, the loss, and the uncertainty, there was peace in this moment. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The town had changed. The truth had been revealed. And with it came healing. Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Robert, standing beside her, his face filled with quiet pride. Your mother would be proud of you, Sarah. She'd be proud of Max, too. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked down at the dog beside her. I never understood why she kept fighting, why she kept protecting us, even when it seemed hopeless, but now I do. Robert nodded. Because some things are worth dying for, and Max was a symbol of that. Your mother understood the power of loyalty, protection, and love, values that can change everything. Max lifted his head at that moment, his eyes locking with Sarah's. There was something in his gaze that spoke volumes, a silent promise that no matter what, he would always be there. He had done his part. He had saved them all. As Sarah turned to face the horizon, she realized that Hope Valley wasn't just a town anymore. It was a community reborn, stronger and more united than it had ever been before. And it was all because of a mother's sacrifice and a dog's unwavering loyalty. Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. Through the darkness, the betrayal, and the loss, she had found something more. She had found the truth. And in the truth, she had found healing. This story reminds us of the power of loyalty, the strength in protection, and the unbreakable bonds that unite us, even in the most challenging times. As we face our own trials, may we remember the lesson of Max, his ability to protect, to fight against injustice, and to show us what true love looks like. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this story, please comment below and share your thoughts. What did you take away from it? Don't forget to subscribe to the Heart Force channel for more stories like this. And we look forward to hearing your personal dog stories in the comments below.